Hi, everyone. We're just going to give folks maybe 1 or 2 more minutes to trickle in, and then we will get started. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I think we're going to get started here. So I hope everyone can see the slides and see me. We're just going to go over a couple of housekeeping items first. So welcome, everyone. I'm really excited to chat with you today about screening volunteers. If you're a volunteer manager, someone who works with volunteers on a regular basis, you probably know that screening practices are a key part of how you engage and retain your volunteers. So this should be a really good session for either an introduction or a refresher if you might need. So housekeeping notes before we get started. We've muted everyone's sound for the presentation currently, and at the end we will have some time for questions, so we can unmute you guys at the end for some questions. If you have any questions or having some technical issues during the presentation, you can raise your hand. There's a little button somewhere on your screen to be able to raise your hand. And then you can also write questions in the chat box on the right of your screen. Graham Dearden, my colleague, he will be here to help with some tech issues that you might be having, and he'll be monitoring the questions and the chat box as well to sort of note some of those questions that we'll get to at the end of the presentation. At the end, we'll send you a link with the recording of the presentation as well, in case you want to go back and review any of this information. So my name is Vicki Shaughnessy. I am the Senior Coordinator of Learning and Resources for Volunteer Alberta. I've been in the role for a couple of months, so still a little new, but learning the ropes here pretty well. And I've been involved in volunteer engagement and management in a couple other of my previous roles as well. Yeah. Okay, so to get started, first off, what is screening? So screening is an ongoing process to engage those who are best suited to fill volunteer positions in your organization. So screening includes everything from recruiting volunteers, the actual process of screening, so interviews, reference checks, volunteer orientation and training is also included, strategies and practices for engaging and retaining volunteers. It also includes the assessment of risk, the development of policies, and that enables participation, and it addresses safety concerns as well. So screening is more holistic than just an interview process, as we will get into. Screening and a robust screening process is important because it helps to define the relationship between your volunteers, your organization, clients, participants. It really helps to define sort of what those roles are and what those expectations are. Effective screening takes into account skills, experience, qualifications that are required for the volunteer role, and it puts in place an ongoing process to engage those who are best suited to fill the positions of your organization. So again, can't stress enough that it is an ongoing process. So volunteer engagement as a nonprofit organization is at the core of what we do. Engaging skilled and passionate volunteers helps to support our mission and vision and helps us to continue providing essential services and programs for the community. As I'm sure a lot of you know, a lot of our programs and services would not be possible without the help and support of our volunteers. So in this presentation, we're going to go over how to create really good screening practices. And it's important to emphasize that volunteer engagement shouldn't just be looked at as one person's job. Discussions need to happen between all levels of folks involved in your organization. So that's board members and executive leadership, that's volunteer managers and coordinators, staff members, as well as the frontline volunteers as well. So having a holistic understanding of how your organization interacts with volunteers is key to success. So how do all of these three different levels of your organization all interact in the screening process? And we'll go over board members and leadership first. So the board members and leadership, their key focus areas are policies, governance, risk and liability, due diligence, and duty of care. So they create an environment for effective and accountable volunteer engagement that includes the recruitment and retention. And they're normally involved in creating the policies and assessing risk and liabilities from that, sort of macro position in your organization. They're also responsible for the reputation and public perception of your organization, which is really important to volunteer engagement and retention because volunteers are also often public face of your organization. They're the voice in your community representing your community. Board members and leadership are also responsible to provide due diligence and duty of care. And duty of care is a particular term that has specific definitions that we're going to go over later as well. So how does that middle group of staff, volunteer managers play into volunteer screening? They look at recruitment, retention, positions and roles, responsibilities of the volunteer, and then they also have a duty of care as well. So because the volunteer managers work so closely with volunteers, they can inform policy based on their experience. They are most oftentimes content matter experts around volunteer engagement. And they're the people who know exactly what volunteers are responsible for doing, and they have a more granular understanding of each volunteer's experience. They're in a little bit more of that day-to-day contact with them, and they're going to have a little bit more of that context and information. How do the volunteers play into the volunteer screening process? So basically, they are an excellent resource to be able to go back to and check as to whether or not the screening practices are working, whether your engagement strategy is working or not, how things can be improved or updated. They should be the people you go to when you want to get feedback about volunteering with their organization. They are a huge resource, and I think we can't forget how valuable it is to be able to engage them in the process of developing policies, revising policies, improving policies as well. So we have 3 keys to screening that we're going to focus on in this presentation. So the first key is responsible volunteer engagement. This is also where we're going to introduce important terms and concepts and sort of define some things. Key number 2 is Volunteer Canada's 10 steps to screening. This is a really nifty it's a handbook that goes over 10 steps to screening. It's really robust, and we're going to go over a little bit of that information. And I believe that I also included that handbook as a handout in this presentation as well. So somewhere on your screen, you should be able to click a drop-down menu and access some handouts as well. So you can kind of read through that as we're going through it as well. Key number 3 is creating volunteer position descriptions. So we're going to go over tangible information on creating positions that work for your organizations and help with the screening and engagement process. Okay, so key number 1, responsible volunteer engagement. So this key will explore how screening impacts and affects all levels of your organizations, from board members to volunteer managers and other staff, and to volunteers and clients. So we're going to cover police information checks and the types of checks you can request, and we're going to review some of the terminology as well. So here's where we give our sort of warning bell here that we want to remind you guys that Volunteer Alberta, we are not lawyers, we are not experts on all things screening, and the content of this presentation is not intended to offer legal advice. So if you do have concerns specific to your organization about risk management or liability or the law, we do encourage you to seek out legal advice from a professional or your insurance provider. So volunteer screening, we don't currently have required standards for volunteer screening in Alberta. It's an important practice and it's often expected by stakeholders. So for example, a parent may not even want to volunteer to be a coach for their child if they haven't been screened themselves. They may think, have other coaches been screened in a responsible and appropriate manner, and they may want to know that information. So it's good to be able to present screening practices front-facing in terms of optics as well. Oftentimes, people think of screening as being the same as getting a police information check, but that's only one step. It's also important to remember that police information checks and vulnerable sector checks are a simplistic overview of an individual. And yes, they are important, but they only provide a more holistic picture when it combines with other steps of the screening process. The screening process is enhanced or supported by information in a police information check or vulnerable sector check, but they shouldn't be the only step to your organization. And that's an important step of your risk management strategy as well as screening strategy. So before we get further, we want to sort of give an overview of the definitions that we might be using, and that has relevance for some of the screening practices and policies we're going to be talking about. So the first definition we want to go over is duty of care. Duty of care is a legal principle and the fundamental premise underlying volunteer screening. So duty of care is the obligation to fulfill a legal, ethical, and moral duty to care for and protect clients, volunteers, employees, and in even some cases, funders. The appropriate level or standard is dependent upon the reasons why your organization exists and the people involved. Basically, what client base do you serve? Duty of care is applied to both individuals and organizations. So that means that you as an individual, as an employee, a volunteer, or a client does have a duty of care, but your organization as a whole also has that duty of care. So basically stated, duty of care is your basic responsibility to care about and for the people around you in a professional manner. One of the main reasons a nonprofit or voluntary organization or volunteer manager may ask for a police information check is because it's a tangible, simple way to attempt to fulfill one's duty of care, and it's one step in that process. Standard of care is another definition we want to go over. So standard of care is the degree or level of service, attention, care, and protection that one owes another according to the law. So you might also hear standard of care is referred to as reasonable care. Reasonable care has a lot to do with negligence, sort of the opposite. Courts in the past have determined negligence by judging whether a person engages in an act or omissions that they could reasonably know would cause harm to others. So for example, someone might not be providing reasonable care if they are working in and around a children's play area and leave dangerous chemicals or equipment in the play area. So a person might be considered negligent in that case because they should reasonably know that leaving chemicals or things like that could reasonably harm a child. Another example that might be relevant to many small nonprofits who use the volunteer screening program is if a coach simply leaves a child unsupervised and unattended for any period of time, if they host practice perhaps on an unsafe playing field. These are situations that might be deemed to not be providing an adequate standard of care for the children that they are tasked with. And the standard of care you provide in a situation must account for the safety of all involved. It's not just about the volunteer, it's not just about the client, but it's about your staff, it's about your organization, it's about everybody coming into contact with the program as well. One last small note about the topic that's relevant for board members. So we know lots of volunteer managers for small nonprofits are also working board members, but if we're talking about legal responsibilities for your organization, duty of loyalty is something to keep in mind as well. So to give a simple breakdown, it's your duty to act in the best interest of the organization, meaning to serve the mission and vision of the organization. So as a volunteer manager or board member, it's important to act honestly, with integrity, in the interest of your organization. So that means no cutting corners for personal gain or professional gain, no using volunteers for your own gain instead of the organization's gain. It's essentially the conflict of interest duty. More often than not, duty of loyalty applies more to fiduciary responsibility, like not using the organization for any financial gain, but it has application as well when you're deploying the organization's resources and volunteers as well. So just a little side note there. So the next definition we want to go over is vulnerable person. So the Criminal Records Act actually defines a vulnerable person as one who, because of their age, either under 18 or over 65, a disability or other circumstance, whether temporary or permanent, is in a position of dependency on others and is otherwise at a greater risk of being harmed than the general population by a person in a position of trust or authority towards them. A little bit of a mouthful, but we'll get into it. So basically, we encourage everyone to take into consideration the second part of that definition and really consider vulnerability on a case-by-case basis. This definition that we provide here and in the Criminal Act is good in a general way, but there's obviously special circumstances that may apply differently and may cause a person to be vulnerable in different situations. So for example, think about your clients or employees or friends or family and think about what circumstances might make them vulnerable. For example, is a new Canadian that still has to deal with language barriers or a translator, could they potentially be vulnerable? Someone who belongs to the LGBTQ community, could they be considered vulnerable in some situations over another? So it really does need to be considered on a case-by-case basis. The definition is great, but as always, we need to have a little bit of judgment call as well, depending on the situation. So within that definition of vulnerable person, it says a position of trust or authority. So we also want to define that term as well. So the definition of a position of trust and authority can be subjective and can be based on opinion, but there are some common factors that help to determine if someone is in a position of trust or authority. So the first is decision-making power over a vulnerable person. So this might be someone like a teacher who has the ability to sway a person's decision-making one way or another, or has the ability to sort of, mandate certain things or sort of direct the person to do certain things or another. The second factor is whether or not a person has unsupervised access to a vulnerable person. So a good example of this might be a coach. They could potentially have a lot of one-on-one or alone time with a person while they're in training. And the third thing to consider is inherent closeness in their relationship with a vulnerable person. So that's something like a big brother or big sister mentor, where there's a lot of, personal sharing going on, a lot of self-disclosures, things like that. That has an inherent closeness in the relationship. We also consider a position of trust and authority as where someone conducts personal tasks for a person. So that's something like perhaps a Meals on Wheels driver for seniors, or even someone who might even be preparing food for a group of seniors or a group of vulnerable people. Yeah. And lastly, we also consider someone in a position of trust and authority when they take full responsibility for the well-being of another. So for example, like a live-in caregiver, a respite nurse, something like that. So understanding these terms, duty of care, standard of care, vulnerable person, and position of trust and authority are fairly important when we're discussing screening in general, but they're also very useful to help us understand the world of police information checks. So in the process of deciding to get a police information check, the risk assessment matrix is a tool that can help you explore some of the concepts we just discussed and what those terms might look like in a specific volunteer position for your organization. So I do believe I also attached this risk assessment matrix as a handout to the presentation, so you guys can take a look through that, and it might be helpful for you guys as well. The first thing, though, that often people think of when they think of duty or care, standard practice, things like that, is the police information check. So it can't be your only form of duty of care like we've chatted about already, but it is very widely used and it's important for many organizations and insurance companies. So we're going to talk a little bit about them. So before you even go about getting a police information check, it's important to consider a few things that might create roadblocks. So there are many different terms used across the country to describe a police information check. Even before you get started, it might be helpful to reach out to your local police service, ask what they call their police information checks, and also what their process is for performing checks. Some municipalities will perform these checks using an electronic system, some in person, some may help you over the phone. It's a really good idea to contact the local police service about this and basically just ask them any and all information they can provide you about their police information checks as that might be relevant for you. The next thing that's important to consider is if you actually have a plan for how to deal with the information contained on a police information check if and when it shows up. So before asking your volunteer for a police information check, you should be talking to your organization, all of those different levels, board, leadership, staff, about the risk related to the volunteer position you're getting a check done for. What criminal history could appear in the check that would be off limits for this position? What could be criminal history that could still be okay and considered, we can still work with this volunteer? And also, what information doesn't come up on a police information check that you'd still want to know after you get the check done? The last thing too is how will your organization handle communicating with a volunteer if the check reveals a red flag? It's nice to have some of those things decided before something comes up, and that way you don't have to scramble to sort of react to the situation. You can be preventative and have a plan in place. Next thing to consider is what is your process when you're actually interacting with the police? Are you sending your volunteer to go obtain the check for themselves? Are you getting the check done on their behalf and having the information released to your organization? And if you would like to do the check on behalf of your volunteers, they need to give you permission to obtain these checks on your behalf. So this is kind of just some logistical things you should think about before asking your volunteers to get checks done. Lastly, consider the process your municipal police service employs to do the checks. How much does it cost? How long does it take? How does that affect your work? How is that going to affect your timeline and eventual delivery of services by the volunteer? So when you go get a police information check done, there's numerous different sources for the information you might receive. In this presentation, we won't cover all the specific things that could be disclosed in a police information check because honestly, there's so many different types of information that you could receive. But if you do want more information on those particular kinds of things that do get disclosed, we highly encourage you to look at the Alberta Police Information Check Disclosure Guidelines, and I attach those to the webinar. It's a big, long document, but you should be able to look through and kind of search and get a little bit better of an idea of what information is included, their process, their procedures, and that provides just a little bit more context so you kind of know what you're asking your volunteers to get into. Overall, though, when you're getting a police information check, there's a limited number of places that the information can come from. The first place is the Canadian Police Information Centre, which is a national database. Then there's also the Police Information Portal, which is a tool that provides indexes of local police records across Canada. Provincially, police can also access the Justice Online Information Network, which is actually the Alberta Courts database. And lastly, local police record databases are also used when processing police information checks. Beyond the regular police information checks, you can also request a vulnerable sector check of the police service. A VSC is done in addition to a PIC, and it's not a separate document or process. VSCs are meant to only be performed when an individual be in a position of trust and authority of that vulnerable person. So those definitions really come into play. The main difference in a vulnerable sector check is that it will access the above databases to provide the information in a normal PIC, but it will also confirm if the applicant has not received a record suspension for sexual offenses as well. So overall, it would be fantastic if there was a clear-cut way to determine if your volunteers need to get a PIC or a VSC, but honestly, it really does depend on the circumstance of your organization. This is why we remind people on a regular basis that we don't provide legal advice and we aren't liable for your organization's specific usage of PICs and VSCs. It really has to be a case-by-case basis. There are no policies that mandate the use of PICs for your volunteers across the board. Even when we consider duty of care, PICs can be one part of a multifaceted approach to fulfilling duty of care. There are sometimes requirements for insurance agencies or from parent organizations to perform PICs outside of the normal scope one might receive a PIC. But organizations should overall be aware that your screening processes should request PICs and VSCs when needed and not as a blanket procedure for every single volunteer. There are some good rules of thumb to follow when it comes to identifying when a police information check is needed. So according to the screening handbook that we mentioned earlier, published by Volunteer Canada and Public Safety Canada, one of the main reasons a volunteer would get a police information check is if they are in contact with a vulnerable person or population, but they're not necessarily in a position of trust and authority. So for an example, you might ask someone taking tickets at a fundraiser for senior citizens to get a police information check because they'll likely be in contact with the vulnerable people, but they're not really in a position of significant trust or authority because it's really incidental. It's kind of that one-off interaction. You'd also consider a police information check if the volunteer is handling money, financial information, or sensitive information overall. So for example, if you have a volunteer that handles a cash register or a float for your organization, this might be considered a reasonable time to get a police information check. Lastly, if the volunteer has access to vehicles or expensive equipment as part of their duties, this also might be a reason to get a police information check. Vulnerable sector check reasonable uses are a bit more strict than the police information checks. Police information checks are asked for in many different circumstances, but the vulnerable sector checks are only supposed to be asked for when specific criteria are met as per the Criminal Records Act and the Alberta Police Information Check Disclosure Guidelines. So a vulnerable sector check is required when an individual be in a position of trust or authority over a vulnerable person. And as we discussed earlier, a position of trust and authority is not merely someone who comes in contact with a vulnerable person. A position of trust and authority has to be significant and a result of the volunteer's position. So as I said before, essentially a person's position of trust and authority cannot be incidental or one-off. It's repeated and it happens kind of over time. The level of supervision, unsupervised or supervised access isn't necessarily something outlined in the Criminal Records Act, but for us, it's a really good metric for determining someone's level of trust and authority. If someone is in a position of trust and authority and is given time alone with a vulnerable person, there's usually a reason to seek a vulnerable sector check because they have a duty to care for the well-being of that person if no one else can. So with all of this, it's really important to find a balance in the screening process. Part of this balance is understanding the limitations and the benefits to police information checks. So in terms of the limitations, one of the limitations can simply be cost. This can be a burden to your organization if you've decided to cover the cost for volunteers. It can be a burden for the volunteers themselves if they can't necessarily pay for the police information check. And the costs actually range from $15 to even up to $70 per check in some places. And the cost is typically higher for those of you working with volunteers in urban communities as well. Another potential limitation is time, the length of time it takes to obtain a police information check. Are you putting the volunteers in their role before you have that information from police services? Are you waiting? How does this affect your volunteer engagement, your turnover rate, your retention rate? All of those things should be taken into consideration. Another thing to think of is privacy. How do you store the information you receive? How do you interpret the information? Like we said earlier, having a policy on how you're going to respond or how you're going to communicate the information to a potential volunteer is really important. What convictions are a no-go to volunteering with your organization? How long do you keep the information you collect? How is the information disposed of? Volunteers have a right to know that their information and data are going to be protected and going to be kept private as well. So participation is another thing that we need to consider as well. So we'll illustrate an example for this limitation. So a person wishes to volunteer with your organization and they have a record, a conviction for a DUI that happened when they turned 18. It's been several years since and no other infractions are on their file. Are they allowed to volunteer with your organization? Why or why not? You'd be surprised how many organizations would not work with this volunteer and has no policies to support receiving or handling information that they may not expect. The last thing to consider sort of on the limitation side is trust. Do your volunteers feel as if you or the organization does not trust their intentions? Do they just want to volunteer without the hassle of screening? Organizations have expressed a 3-to-1 drop-off rate when a PIC or VSC is required. This doesn't mean that the volunteers are bad, but they feel like they're not trusted. There's also something to a trauma-informed perspective as well. The process of getting a vulnerable sector check or a PIC done for a person that has experience with trauma, going into a police station may be traumatic for them as well. So that might also be another reason why there's that 3-to-1 drop-off rate when a PIC or VIC is required. Again, doesn't mean the volunteers are a bad person, but there could be some issues with trust around that for sure. So let's go over to the benefit side. So the benefits is protection. You're ensuring your clients are safe from potential harm, and that is a huge, huge benefit. Your organization is taking steps to provide your duty of care, and that's really important. So the risk and liability, often organizations are expected to perform police information checks as part of the risk mitigation and liability insurance. Are you fulfilling a requirement from your board by doing PICs and VSCs? Maybe your insurance provider requires that. It's important to note here that Volunteer Alberta partners with the cooperators who are honestly a wealth of knowledge when it comes to risk management and nonprofit liability. So if you'd like some more information on the cooperators and their services, or if you have any specific questions to ask about risk management, please let us know and we'll definitely connect with you after the presentation. Another thing on the benefit side is care and safety. You're being diligent in putting the needs of your clients and those you serve first, which is really important. So participation was on sort of the limitation side, and it's also on the benefit side as well. So organizations may require people to have police information checks as part of their screening. As a volunteer manager, are you required to have volunteers undergo these types of screening? Depending on the types of clients you work with and engage, you may have to conduct these types of screenings in order for people to volunteer with your client base at all. So obviously that's a benefit. If you need to be able to ensure that your clients are safe, to get that assurance that your clients will be safe, that is a huge benefit. And trust, again, is on both sides as well. So your organization is going to be perceived as being more trustworthy if you conduct PICs. It attracts insurance providers, board members, participating clients and their families, because they know that you're taking care of the clients and that you care about their safety. People want to be assured that an organization has good intentions and is sufficiently screening. This will also help increase your levels of participation in the organization. Overall, like the slide says, it's a fine balance, and it's important to address a volunteer's concerns and remember to see opportunities and not just the limitations when it comes to effective screening. All right, so on to key number 2. Key number 2 is following the 10 steps of screening. So we just spent a lot of time reviewing the legal terminology and discussing police checks, but as we've said multiple times, that's only one part of potential screening. So we want to look more holistically at the screening process. This key will introduce Volunteer Canada's screening handbook and discuss the 10 steps to screening. So the Volunteer Canada Handbook is a really thorough guide, and it was created to help organizations just like yours create, revise, and use screening practices when recruiting volunteers. I can tell you I've read through it, and it's really actionable. It really is presented in a way that makes sense, is easy to digest. They give a lot of really concrete examples. It's a really great guide. And what's also nice about it is that the 10 steps to screening are scalable. They're simple, they're robust, and they're in-depth all at the same time. The 10 steps to screening isn't just for complicated or high-risk volunteer opportunities. They really do make a difference and are effective for all volunteer programs. I'm laughing because we obviously really love the 10 steps to screening. All right, so the 10 steps are broken into 3 categories. The pre-hiring process, which includes determining policies and risks, writing clear volunteer position descriptions, and establishing a recruitment process. Then there's the hiring process itself, which goes over an application form, conducting interviews, references, follow-up, and requesting the appropriate PIC and VIC when necessary. And the last section is managing volunteers, which includes conducting training and orientation, supervise and evaluate, as well as the follow-up and feedback as well. So we'll go through all of these in broken down chunks here. So starting with the pre-hiring process, this is going to involve the same people that we mentioned in key 1 in the beginning of our slide. All of those different levels of the folks involved in your organization. So that includes board members, senior leadership, and volunteer managers as well. So step 1 is to determine policies and risks. You want to be sure to include everyone in that discussion and have a shared concrete understanding of the risks of your organization and participants, so you can set policies that ensure the safety of everyone. And this is where too it's important to include everybody from board members down to volunteers themselves, because if you have conducted a risk assessment, perhaps a volunteer has identified a risk that was accidentally missed, and you really want to make sure to get that feedback. So step 2 is to write clear position descriptions. Something to consider when creating role descriptions are having an idea of the position, the tasks, the requirements needed to complete the role, even a set of skills or physical requirements if they need to be lifting heavy boxes up to 50 pounds or things like that. Basically, what does a typical day look like? Consider this similar to human resources for basically any other position. How do you approach hiring an employee? Paid and unpaid staff should have the same approaches. And that way you also don't have to reinvent the wheel. If you've already gone through hiring staff and have a process set out for that, look at what can be adapted for that for your volunteers as well. Step 3 is establishing a recruitment process. Commit your organization to a process that includes applications, interviews, reference checks, and follow-ups. So in creating volunteer positions, alignment is key. You want to be able to align the skills, requirements, and responsibilities, and that should all be informed by policies and risk assessment as well. So to help support this alignment of volunteering to policy and risk, Volunteer Alberta has created a position description template that also includes a risk assessment and sort of discussion of that. I believe, included that as a handout too. So this tool is going to help you define various positions within your organization and the responsibility of your volunteers. It also provides space to consider necessary qualifications and other considerations, such as clients served or time commitment. And you want to be able to link those considerations to the risks and policies that you have assessed as well. Aligning volunteer positions with risks and policies is incredibly important, and it helps build a robust volunteer engagement program. On our website, we have a really robust resources section, so I really encourage you to check out our website and click on the top menu bar says resources. Scroll down a little bit through the page and you can actually search through. You can categorize certain topics or certain types of resources, whether you'd like a PDF or a webinar or things like that as well. So that's a really neat thing that we have too. And we've also attached the resource to the webinar. All right, so by now you should know who is involved in the hiring process, and it's the same people as we discussed in Q1, basically everybody. So step 4 is you want to use an application form. This step is scalable for any organization, and it doesn't need to be extensive. It can be informal, it can be small, and maybe it only needs, the name and the contact information of the prospective volunteer. Or it can be more robust. Larger organizations tend to require a bit more thorough applications as part of their screening process. And this can include the availability of the volunteer, their hours, time commitment, why they want to volunteer, so a description of their passion and what they're hoping to get out of it, and also their past work experience, perhaps even like a cover letter or a resume, things like that as well, might all be required in an application form. Step 5 is conducting an interview. You want to get to know your volunteers. You want to discover their passions, their interests, and their motivations for volunteering. So much of volunteer retention and engagement comes down to relationship building. It really comes down to, if you have the capacity, if you have the resources and the time, building a relationship with your volunteer. And that can start right in the volunteer interview process. This is also a space to find out more about the volunteer skill set and how it directly applies to the position. Interviews, like the application process, can be more formal, they can be informal depending on your organization. Perhaps your interviews range from a panel style where you have multiple volunteers or multiple staff members, or maybe you even have sort of an informal coffee, or just invite them to the organization for an informal conversation. How you handle this step is up to you, your organization, and your capacities. There's really no right way to do this. It's really about getting to know your volunteer and just starting to build that relationship with them, to learn a bit more about them and their skill set and how they can apply that to the organization. Step 6 is follow up with references. Be sure to ask permission to contact references and check with more than one reference. Personal and professional are okay. Some organizations accept personal, they accept family references. Some organizations say nope, just professional. So again, it's really on a case-by-case basis. It's really subjective, up to what you think is going to best suit your volunteer position, whether it's really about that professional skill set that you want, or whether it's about, getting to know the person a little bit more and kind of how they might build relationships with your clients or things like that. So really think about your references, how many you need, and what types of references you might need as well. So number 7 is requesting the appropriate PIC or VSC. And as we've talked about before, they're not always necessary. So keep in mind the definitions of vulnerable persons and trust and authority. Usually the more access a volunteer has to a vulnerable person or people, the higher degree of screening that is necessary. All right, so managing volunteers. Volunteer managers, supervisors, or any staff member in charge of volunteers should be responsible for the final stage of the 10 steps to screening. This stage is known as the feedback loop, and it supports your organization in finding the right volunteer for the role. So step number 8 includes orientation and training. These sessions support volunteers to understand policies and how to apply these in the workplace. And that leads to a better understanding of the organization overall. Step 9 is supervise and evaluate. This step is really crucial to building a relationship with your volunteers, and it supports their development and the development of the position as well. Trust leads to better engagement and a mutually beneficial experience. We've talked a lot in the presentation about making sure that the volunteer is the right fit for the position. And I think the opposite is true. You want to make sure the position is the right fit for the volunteer as well. What does the volunteer really want to get out of their experience with you? Is it a give and take? Is it really just a one-way relationship from the volunteer to the organization? How can you make sure that that's a mutually beneficial relationship? And that supervision and that evaluation piece that you do with your volunteers can be an incredible step to making sure that it is a mutually beneficial relationship, and that leads to higher engagement, higher retention, higher satisfaction, and all of those types of things as well. The last thing is follow-up and feedback. Listen, listen, listen. Listen to your volunteers and your participants as well. You want to check in with your participants about how their experience has been with particular volunteers or with volunteer positions in general as well. Are there any changes that they would like to see from the ground level? How others see your organizations and services will support volunteer recruitment and engagement. Stories travel. Word of mouth travels. If people have a really good experience, either as a participant or a volunteer with your organization, that story is going to travel and people will tell other people, and then you'll be able to engage and retain more volunteers from those positive experiences as well. So now that we've gone over all of those, the 10 steps might seem a little bit daunting, but honestly, you're probably already doing some, if not most of them. Volunteer Alberta has spent a couple of years looking at volunteer recruitment practices through surveys, focus groups, meetings, other types of conversations. We've connected with over 800 organizations, and 64% of respondents say that they did not use or are even completely unaware of the 10 steps to screening. But this seemed a little odd and surprising to Volunteer Alberta, so we decided to do a little bit more digging. And once we separated the steps out and asked questions about each one individually, we found most organizations are actually using or applying some, if not all, of the steps in their own volunteer recruitment processes. They just didn't identify that they were doing the 10 steps. So even if you don't recognize it yourself, we know that your organizations are most likely using these, and we know that you're doing a fantastic job. So as I mentioned when introducing the 10 steps in the screening handbook is also the scalability of those 10 steps. And we mentioned throughout that any of these 10 steps can be tailored to your organization's size, your resources, your capacity. So this slide kind of provides a brief overview of things your organization can consider. And you can think of it a little bit as sort of, implementation tips. So in terms of your organizational considerations, some things that you may need to consider or adapt to is your capacity of staff, your capacity of the organization and program, so that's time and resources, what budget and funding are available to invest in volunteer recruitment and engagement. Does your organization do volunteer recruitment drives, radio ads? Do you take volunteers for coffee or onboarding by word of mouth? Consider who is doing the work and what their capacity is. Are your volunteer managers even volunteers themselves? And how does that play into how you adapt your retention and engagement and all of those different screening practices and policies as well? Position considerations. So the screening processes can be adapted for different volunteer positions even. Things to consider when adapting the screening processes are the level of risk involved in the position. Is it high? Is it low? Somewhere in the middle? Is the commitment short-term or long-term? Or even maybe is it a micro-volunteering opportunity and really teeny tiny? Are there any additional training requirements that might be needed for the volunteer to successfully fulfill the functions of the role? Some procedural considerations to keep in mind. Does your organization require additional screening? PICs, VSCs, sure, or maybe even a child intervention welfare check, which is a whole other thing. If you have questions about that, you can email us after too. How long does it take to obtain these checks, and can volunteers start without even being cleared? What's your capacity as an organization? Is your process formal or informal, a combination? What is your plan for building, those relationships? And then on the applicant level considerations, what's your level of familiarity with the position or organization? Sorry, what's their level of familiarity with the position or the organization? Do they have qualifications or characteristics that are best suited to the role? Have they been referred by someone, another organization, another volunteer? Have they even been a past participant in your programs at the front line? Are they rural or urban? All of these different things will play a role in determining how best to screen these volunteers, how best to engage them, retain them, how best to even recognize them and say thank you too. All of these different demographics play a role. All right, so the last key here, key number 3, is create winning volunteer positions. So in this key, we'll discuss how to create really awesome position descriptions and recruit and retain great volunteers. So we really want to make sure that recruiting and retaining volunteers, you're creating a mutually beneficial relationship, as I talked about earlier. There can be a lot of pressure from nonprofits, as I'm sure you know, to fill positions quickly and efficiently. So we spend a lot of time and energy investing in our recruitment strategies, and it's important to find the best match, sometimes very, very quickly. Creating meaningful and mutual benefit, it's not easy, and it requires an investment of time, an investment of energy. We want the best volunteers, and we want people who are skilled, motivated, passionate about our work. And so to find the best match, we need to understand the 3 W's: who, what, and why. So who do we exist to serve? What is our mission? What do we envision for our community and our participants? You want to be intentional in crafting that sort of narrative and that idea of what you're really looking for. Some other questions too are, who are our volunteers? What are they looking for, and why are they passionate? These are all important questions to ask and get a sense of when you're building those relationships and identifying fit for your organization as well as the role in general. Understanding our volunteers, why they're personally motivated, and as well as knowing what we offer, such as social opportunities, skill development, training and experience, new experiences, and honestly, job opportunities for some volunteers as well. This will help the position descriptions and roles that inspire mutually beneficial relationships and create meaning. Great position descriptions will help recruit the best person for the role. So when you're thinking about that, look at it all in context. And as we said before in the presentation, don't think about only risks. Think about opportunities as well. Opportunities that the volunteer can provide to you in your organization, but also opportunities that you can provide to the volunteer. And that will create a better relationship overall going forward. So as we mentioned, understanding the who, what, and why of a volunteer position will help create a winning position description. So here are some things to consider and include on a position description. It's always a good idea to share your mission, vision, and values as an organization. So it's right there in the position description. People can find something to get passionate about and, sort of latch onto in that way, find alignment between their values as well as the volunteer position to make sure that it's a good fit. Volunteers are great at raising public awareness and expanding your outreach as well. Like I said before, those stories, they travel. So skilled volunteers are not only a tool for increased recruitment, but they can be the front face of your organization. They can help craft your brand and your voice out to the community as well. So it's important to identify what a position can provide for a volunteer. Keep in mind, volunteers are most likely volunteering for a reason. So adopting a person-centered approach and a volunteer-centered approach and understanding what you have to offer can really boost that engagement. It's also important to be upfront about your screening processes and policies. This will provide opportunities for volunteers to self-select their pathways and roles. It may reduce unexpected barriers to engagement. So if they didn't realize that they were signing up for a long-term screening process or a short-term screening process, it's really good to set expectations so people know what they're coming into. And it can help them understand the level of commitment required as well. Something in here too that made me think about being upfront about your screening processes and policies. I was in a webinar recently and someone mentioned the fact that in a volunteer position, it really highly encouraged minority groups, groups of color, typically marginalized groups to apply. And they said, self-identify yourself as such on the position description. And the person in this webinar said, I'm not used to that. It made me feel a little unsafe because part of me really wanted to identify myself as being part of this group, but another part of me didn't really know why they wanted that information or what they were going to do with that information. And the presenter had a really simple answer for that, which is if you want to encourage those types of applications, to basically explain why on your position description, explain what you're going to do with that information. And that can help to demystify the process for people. So I think being upfront, being open and honest about your screening processes and policies, why you're asking for certain pieces of information can also be really helpful and hopefully establish a little bit more of that trust as well. All right, so you want to also consider possibilities, as we talked about before. Is this role something that is recurring day after day? Is it once a week? Is there a specific time, or does the position offer flexibility in terms of time commitment? These are all things that volunteers, I'm sure, will want to know so that they know they're not going to, leave an organization hanging if they all of a sudden can't commit. And so it's good to have all that information up front. The other thing to be aware of is, does your organization offer static or dynamic positions? And that can also stop gaps from happening. You really want to look at whether your positions need to be structured, have those really hard commitments, or if you can be reactive, be flexible, all of those types of things as well. And sometimes the positions can move between those two different categories. It doesn't, I don't think, have to be one or the other. So in considering all of these possibilities, we want you to remember that the work doesn't stop here. You have to keep your role descriptions current. You have to continue to review them and adapt them to the situation. And that's going to give you more freedom to take on the people who suit your organization and the position in the best way. So think about maybe having, sort of a time loop that, once every so often you make sure to go through and look at those position descriptions and kind of have something that flags your organization to say, oh, it might be time to review those things as well. Sometimes it's good to have those structures in place. So as we've been saying throughout the entire presentation, ideas from everyone is really important. You want to get perspective from everyone. We're highlighting the same people as we did in the first key, that board and leadership, the volunteer managers themselves and staff members, the volunteers, and then the clients and participants as well. You really want to get a holistic view of your policies, and to do that, you need to talk to various people engaged in different levels of your programs and services. So here are some questions for the board and your leadership that they might want to discuss or consider. So what is understood or perceived about volunteer positions and/or the volunteer program? Are your volunteers meeting the desired outcomes? Are policies effective in mitigating risk? Any accountability concerns with your volunteers? And how might the volunteer engagement process or policies be improved upon? You might want to ask volunteers directly some questions like, how was their experience of the screening process overall? Do they have positive feedback, constructive criticism to give? What would they look for in another volunteer? So even sort of a volunteer colleague, who would they want to work with? Who's the best person to work with? Why do they volunteer, and what keeps them coming back? That gets in those motivations. Any opportunities identified or observations for improvement. Volunteers, I think, are in one of the best positions to be able to tell us how to improve our policies and procedures to make the best experience for both them as well as our organization and clients as well. Speaking of clients, your participants are also really important to include in the feedback loop. So here are some questions that you might want to ask them as well. So what is their overall experience with the program or service? What do they look for, need, or expect in relation to a volunteer? What experience do they value most? What keeps them coming back to your organization or your programs? And what do they say about the organization? If someone were to ask them on the street, hey, do you know about this organization? What kind of things would they say about us? What comes top of mind when they think about the organization? So we're coming to the end here, and I just want to review some final thoughts. Basically, when it comes to screening, we really want you to think big picture. Screening is a way to engage volunteers in your organization. Think about how they're recruited, trained, and engaged. And it's not just a police check. Police checks have limitations. A comprehensive screening program is important for mitigating risk, but also to create a strong, vibrant, and engaged group of volunteers. The other thing we want you to keep in mind is engage everyone. You don't have to create a screening program by yourself. Volunteers, board members, employees, and the people who come in contact with your organization and services can contribute greatly to creating and improving your screening practices. Lastly, screening is a balance. Often, screening can really be focused on risk, which obviously is very important and it's a benefit as well. It's used as a way to avoid liability, and sometimes it can be really inflexible. There's that idea that there's just one right way to do it. And honestly, sometimes the one right way doesn't work for everybody. So I'd really encourage you to look at screening as an opportunity to engage and build a relationship with the people that you work with and get them excited about your work. All right. So just as part of this presentation, and if you're looking for any resources, you see this presentation, you're thinking, okay, well, great, but how? How do I do all of these things? Or I want more information. So I'll just review with you the volunteer screening program that Volunteer Alberta does and the different resources and services that we provide. So the first thing that we like to focus on the most is the education piece. One size does not fit all, and so it makes sense for people to be able to learn different avenues, different strategies, different engagement tactics and tools and things like that. And we're always happy to provide education for folks. We have a lot of different presentations and resources on our website as well. So feel free to reach out to us at any time by email or through the website. There's a contact form on our website. If you're looking for resources, definitely let us know. We want to be able to help and provide that. The other part of our program is the vulnerable sector check fee waiver. So this is to eligible organizations who have volunteer positions where they do come in contact with a vulnerable person. They are in a position of significant trust or authority. And as we said before, sometimes that barrier of having to pay for a VSC means that volunteers will drop off. And so we recognize this, and we, in partnership and funding from the government of Alberta, are able to provide some funding to cover the cost of the vulnerable sector check in some municipalities. So we have lots of information about this on our website. We also have contact information too. We've got frequently asked questions and eligibility criteria that you can review on our website. But if you ever have any questions, you can definitely reach out to us directly about that fee waiver and kind of how that program works as well. The last thing is our screening development grants, and that ties back into that education piece. We want to provide supports to people who are developing their policies and procedures related to screening. And this screening development grant provides micro grants of up to $3,000 for organizations to either develop, if they've never had them before, or update their screening practices. And that includes the entire 10 steps. That includes engagement, retention, the feedback and evaluation piece as well. So, you know, we're pretty open to the definition of that, and we really want to make sure that the grant is used in a way that's useful for your organizations. So most of the participants here are part of the grant right now, but some of you aren't. And so our granting period and the applications for that are closed this year, but they will reopen next year. So certainly look on our website, and we will be posting information about, you know, the due dates and the application process and all of that kind of stuff as well. As always, though, feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions about the screening development grant as well. All right, so this is basically just a summary of sort of our most used resources and templates that can help to enhance or build your screening practices. So, excuse me. I see here that Graham has popped into the chat here, and he's put a link to the resources section on our website. So just play around in the resources section there, and certainly always reach out to us if you have any questions about those. All right, so I think that is it, and I just whipped through this presentation super quickly here, so hopefully I didn't talk too fast for you guys. I apologize if I did. And yeah, I guess we will take this minute for any questions that you might have. Graham, if you have anything to add that I might have missed or didn't dive into enough during the presentation, certainly jump in and let me know.
Unmuted.
Hey Vicky, yeah, no, that was great. And I also realized that it's a lot of content. So if you're interested or had notes going through that you wanted us to clarify, like feel free to, you can use the hands up button to let us know that you want to speak, or you can post questions in the questions pane and we can answer them directly. But I did want to mention one thing, you know, like around the police information check stuff, like we provide a lot of information on that stuff to participants at the beginning of the presentation, because we know that a lot of organizations are very kind of like focused on that. And, you know, even if your organization is kind of like moving in a direction that's like a little bit less focused on police information checks, we know that there's a lot of kind of, you know, pressure from people to provide them. So we try to give, you know, some best practices around police information checks, but that conversation is evolving. So we always try to let people know that, that, you know, they're kind of limited in use, police information checks and vulnerable sector checks. There's a lot of different ways to kind of assess risk and things like that with the community. Okay. I see a question here from Joelle. Yeah, so Joelle from Volunteer Strathcona received a template from the RCMP detachment on how to best write a VSC letter. Would this be useful to share? Joelle, absolutely. In fact, if you want to pop onto the base camp, because I think you're part of the Screening Development Grant cohort, that would be really helpful to actually share with the group, I think. And that goes for anybody else who's kind of part of the Screening Development Grant cohort as well. If you have any kind of like resources that you think might be helpful for the community, definitely jump into the base camp and feel free to share it out. if you have anything that you kind of think would be helpful for us to kind of just integrate into our program for the general public, then feel free to send that our way as well, and we can kind of keep that in mind because we're constantly thinking about resource development for the program. Awesome. Thanks, Joel. Any other questions? Not seeing anything here. Vicky, did you have anything you want to add before we head out?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, basically, I can't say it enough. Like anytime you guys have questions or need resources or anything like that, please do reach out to us. It even helps us for our data to know what kind of resources we should be creating, tip sheets and things like that as well. So yeah, please always let us know if you have questions or want any support in developing or creating those screening practices.
Yeah, totally. And also, we will be sending out the recording of this and the handouts. So if you ever want to kind of review this again, we can have that available for you. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, one last thing I wanted to mention as well is that if you were curious about sort of like the hiring and recruitment practices or the developing policies and assessing risk, we are actually going to be offering 2 webinars coming up later this month, both on Tuesday. I believe the next Tuesday is coming up is the 23rd. So we're having a presentation on volunteer recruitment and hiring that day, a webinar. From 10:30 to noon, same time as this morning. And then on November 30th, we're going to be offering another webinar on developing policy and managing/assessing risk. So if you guys are interested in that, feel free to send me an email. We will be posting registration links to those presentations on our social media, Facebook and LinkedIn as well. But yeah, definitely let me know if you want links to those, and I'll be sure to send them to you as well. All right, well, I think that's it. Thank you guys so much for attending. I hope that the session has been useful for you. I believe when I shut out of this presentation, it will automatically direct you to a survey page. It's really useful for us to know what information in these webinars is useful to you, relevant to you, any positive feedback or constructive criticism. We are open and happy to hear. So if you wouldn't mind taking just a minute or two to fill out that survey at the end of this presentation, that would certainly help us out too. So. Great. Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate your time. And yeah, I'm sure I will chat or work with some of you again in the future.
Awesome.
Thanks, everyone. Bye now.
Thanks. Bye.